true crime.
Episode 4, The Investigation. Chapter 1, January 15, 1947, 10 a.m. The morning air in Leimert Park hung cool and still, the kind of California winter morning that promised warmth by noon but delivered a chill that made mothers bundle their children despite the coming sunshine. Betty Berzinger had wrapped her 3-year-old daughter against that chill, adjusting the child's coat one more time before setting out on their morning walk down South Norton Avenue. It was a routine they followed several times a week, a simple circuit through the neighborhood that gave the toddler fresh air and gave Betty a moment of peace in what was shaping up to be an ordinary Wednesday. The neighborhood itself was unremarkable in the way that most residential areas become invisible to those who traverse them daily. Modest homes lined the street, their front yards maintained with the casual attention of working families. At the intersection of South Norton Avenue and 39th Street, the vacant lots that interrupted the residential pattern were equally unremarkable, the kind of undeveloped parcels that dotted Los Angeles in those post-war years when the city was still sprawling outward, still deciding what it would become. Betty noticed the pale shape from perhaps 30 feet away. Her first thought, the one that would echo through police reports and newspaper accounts for decades to come, was that someone had discarded a department store mannequin in the vacant lot. The conclusion was reasonable, even logical. The object was pale, positioned oddly, and appeared artificial in the morning light. Los Angeles in 1947 was experiencing a construction boom, and vacant lots often became impromptu dumping grounds for everything from broken furniture to commercial refuse. But as Betty drew closer, still pushing her daughter's stroller, still operating under the assumption that she was looking at discarded retail equipment, the details began to assert themselves in ways that contradicted her initial assessment. The positioning was wrong. The color was wrong. The texture, even from a distance, suggested something organic rather than manufactured. She stopped walking approximately 15 feet from the object. Her daughter, oblivious to the shift in her mother's attention, continued her toddler's narration of the world around her. Betty's mind worked through the visual information, processing and rejecting explanations in rapid succession. Not a mannequin. The pale surface wasn't the smooth plastic of retail display equipment. Not furniture. Not construction debris. Not anything that belonged in a vacant lot on a Wednesday morning in January. The body was severed cleanly at the waist. This detail, the one that would dominate every subsequent account of the discovery, was immediately apparent to Betty Berzinger. The two sections were positioned approximately 12 inches apart, arranged with a precision that suggested deliberate staging rather than accidental disposal. The torso section lay on its back, arms positioned above the head in a way that mimicked surrender or display. The lower section was aligned with anatomical correctness, as if the killer had maintained some ghastly respect for the human form even while obliterating it. Betty Berzinger's response was immediate and appropriate. She turned the stroller sharply, creating a barrier between her daughter and the scene in the vacant lot. She moved with the controlled urgency of a mother whose primary instinct was to shield her child from trauma while simultaneously addressing the emergency at hand. The nearest house was perhaps 50 yards back up the street, and Betty covered the distance rapidly, her mind already formulating the words she would use to explain what she had seen without fully acknowledging what it meant. The homeowner who answered Betty's urgent knock would later tell reporters that the young mother had been very shaken but very clear in her account. She needed to use the telephone. She needed to call the police. There was a body in the vacant lot. The homeowner, whose name would appear in initial police reports before being largely forgotten by history, allowed Betty to make the call while keeping her daughter occupied in the front room, away from the windows that faced South Norton Avenue. The call reached the LAPD switchboard at 10:15 a.m. The log entry, preserved in police archives, records the report with bureaucratic efficiency: possible homicide, South Norton Avenue at 39th Street, female victim, body discovered by civilian. The dispatcher assigned the call to the nearest patrol unit, a standard black and white cruiser occupied by officers Frank Perkins and Will Fitzgerald, two uniformed patrolmen whose regular beat covered the Leimert Park area. Perkins and Fitzgerald arrived at the scene at approximately 10:25 a.m. Their approach to the vacant lot represented the first in a cascade of procedural failures that would ultimately compromise the investigation before it had properly begun. Neither officer had responded to a scene of this nature before. Leimert Park was not a high-crime area. Homicides, when they occurred, tended to be domestic situations resolved quickly through witness statements and physical evidence that remained largely undisturbed. What Perkins and Fitzgerald encountered in the vacant lot at South Norton and 39th bore no resemblance to anything in their training or experience. The first mistake was a failure to immediately secure a perimeter. Standard procedure, even in 1947, called for responding officers to establish a boundary around any crime scene before conducting even a preliminary examination. The purpose was twofold: to preserve potential evidence from contamination and to prevent civilian interference that might compromise the investigation. Perkins and Fitzgerald, confronted with a scene that defied their understanding of criminal violence, failed to take this basic step. Instead, they approached the body directly, walking through the vacant lot without attention to footprints, disturbed earth, or any other trace evidence that might have been preserved. They confirmed what Betty Berzinger had reported, that the victim was deceased, that the death was clearly a homicide, that the staging suggested premeditation and psychological pathology beyond the norm. They radioed for detectives and a coroner's wagon. And then, in a decision that would haunt the investigation for decades, they waited at the scene without establishing crowd control. The neighborhood response was immediate and overwhelming. Betty Berzinger's urgent visit to a nearby house had not gone unnoticed. Other residents, seeing the police cruiser parked at the vacant lot, emerged from their homes to investigate. Word spread through the informal networks that governed residential communities, the quick exchanges of information between neighbors who knew each other by sight if not by name. Within 15 minutes of Perkins and Fitzgerald's arrival, a crowd had begun to gather at the edges of the vacant lot. The crowd included children. This detail, mentioned in several contemporary accounts but largely overlooked in later analyses, represented a particular failure of crowd control. Among the spectators were school-age children, some of whom had been playing in nearby yards when the police arrived. They stood at the periphery of the scene, their presence unacknowledged by the officers who should have been managing access to the area. Some of these children would later give interviews to newspapers, their accounts colored by trauma and incomplete understanding. None should have been present. The crowd also included reporters. Los Angeles in 1947 operated under a system where police scanners provided immediate notification of significant calls. The major newspapers, the Examiner and the Herald Express in particular, maintained networks of reporters and photographers who monitored police frequencies and responded to potential stories with a speed that often matched official response times. By 10:45 a.m., less than half an hour after Perkins and Fitzgerald's arrival, at least 3 newspaper photographers were present at the scene, their cameras documenting not just the body but the chaotic response that surrounded it. The photographs from that morning, some of which would be published in afternoon editions and others which would remain in newspaper archives, document the contamination in real time. Civilians are visible within feet of the body. Footprints crisscrossed the vacant lot in multiple directions. The perimeter, when it was eventually established, encompassed only the immediate area around the remains, leaving large sections of the lot accessible to anyone who wished to approach. Detectives arrived at approximately 11 a.m. By this time, the scene had been compromised beyond recovery. The lead detective, whose frustration would be evident in later reports, immediately ordered a wider perimeter, but the damage was irreversible. Any footprints that might have belonged to the killer were now mixed with prints from officers, reporters, and civilians. Any trace evidence that might have been transferred to the ground had been disturbed by foot traffic. Any possibility of reconstructing the killer's approach or departure route had been eliminated. The physical evidence at the scene was simultaneously abundant and useless. The body itself provided numerous details about the murder, but the context in which it was discovered, the spatial relationships and environmental traces that might have pointed toward a suspect or methodology, had been obliterated within the first hour of the investigation. Later analysis would identify this first hour as the critical failure point. Not the only failure, certainly, and not even the most consequential in terms of investigative direction, but the irreversible one. Evidence contamination can sometimes be worked around through careful analysis and documentation. Evidence destruction cannot be remedied. In the vacant lot at South Norton and 39th, in the 60 minutes between Betty Berzinger's discovery and the establishment of proper crime scene protocols, the physical investigation died before it began. The body remained in place for several more hours while photographers and forensic specialists documented what they could. The coroner's team arrived in early afternoon, and the remains were transported to the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office for examination. The vacant lot was eventually emptied of spectators, though curiosity seekers would return throughout the day and for weeks afterward. The investigation had begun, but it had begun from a position of irreversible compromise, a fact that would shape everything that followed. Chapter 2, The Autopsy, January 16. The Los Angeles County Coroner's Office occupied a nondescript building that reflected the bureaucratic nature of death investigation in mid-century America. The facility processed hundreds of bodies annually, most representing unremarkable endings to ordinary lives. Traffic accidents, industrial mishaps, natural deaths that required official certification, the occasional suicide or domestic homicide. The staff approached their work with professional detachment, understanding that emotions served no purpose in the documentation of mortality. Dr. Frederick Newbarr had conducted thousands of autopsies over his career. His reputation within the Los Angeles medical and law enforcement communities rested on meticulous technique and conservative interpretation of findings. He did not speculate beyond what the physical evidence could support. He did not offer theories about criminal motivation or investigative direction. He examined bodies, documented injuries, determined causes of death, and provided law enforcement with factual foundations upon which to build their cases. The body that arrived at the coroner's office on the afternoon of January 15 challenged that professional detachment in ways that Newbarr would later acknowledge in private conversations. The scheduled autopsy, conducted on January 16, would become one of the most scrutinized medical examinations in American criminal history, its findings debated, reinterpreted, and sensationalized for decades. The examination began with identification. The body bore no identification documents, no jewelry, no clothing that might provide immediate answers about the victim's identity. The fingerprints, however, were intact and well preserved. This detail, which might seem minor against the backdrop of the injuries inflicted, would prove crucial. The prints were photographed, processed, and transmitted to the FBI's Identification Division in Washington, D.C. The FBI response came with remarkable speed, a reflection of both the seriousness of the case and a fortunate circumstance of bureaucratic record-keeping. The victim's fingerprints were on file as a result of a wartime employment application. Elizabeth Short, born July 29, 1924, in Hyde Park, Massachusetts. 22 years old. Last known address in California. Employment history in various wartime industries that required security clearances and fingerprint documentation. The identification transformed the investigation from an abstract puzzle into a specific tragedy. Elizabeth Short had a family, a history, a life that could be traced and documented. The victim was no longer simply a body in a vacant lot but a person whose movements and associations could be mapped, whose final days could be reconstructed, whose killer might be found among the people who had intersected with her brief life. But before the investigation could pursue those biographical threads, Dr. Newbarr had to complete the medical examination. His findings, documented in a report that would eventually span multiple pages of technical detail, established the factual framework that would support and contradict various theories for the next 75 years. The cause of death was determined to be hemorrhage and shock due to concussion of the brain and lacerations of the face. This finding would surprise many who assumed that the bisection of the body represented the fatal injury. The medical evidence indicated otherwise. Elizabeth Short had been alive when the facial injuries were inflicted. She had bled from those wounds. She had suffered neurological trauma that, combined with blood loss, had resulted in her death. The bisection had occurred post-mortem, an act of mutilation rather than murder, though the distinction offered little comfort to anyone involved in the investigation. The facial lacerations were severe and distinctive. The injuries extended from the corners of the mouth toward the ears, creating what pathologists refer to as a Glasgow smile, or Chelsea grin, named for the gang violence that popularized the injury pattern in Glasgow, Scotland. The cuts had been made with precision, extending through multiple layers of tissue. The wounds would have been horrifically painful and would have prevented the victim from crying out effectively, the damaged facial structure making speech or screaming nearly impossible. The ligature marks told their own story. Elizabeth Short had been restrained at the wrists, ankles, and thighs. The marks indicated prolonged binding, pressure applied over hours rather than minutes. The pattern suggested she had been held in a position that restricted movement while allowing the killer access to her body for the infliction of other injuries. The ligatures had not been the cause of death but were clear evidence of extended captivity and torture. The body had been completely drained of blood. This finding generated immediate speculation about methodology and location. The human body contains approximately 5 liters of blood. The removal of that volume, either through gravity drainage or active extraction, required time, equipment, and a location where such an activity could be conducted without interruption. The body, when discovered, had shown no evidence of blood pooling or staining in the vacant lot where it was found. The murder had occurred elsewhere, and the body had been transported to the disposal site only after the killer had completed the post-mortem mutilation. The body had also been washed post-mortem. This detail suggested awareness of forensic evidence on the killer's part. The washing had been thorough, removing potential trace evidence that might have pointed toward a specific location or occupation. The skin showed no residue of soil, fibers, or other material that might have transferred during the commission of the crime. The cleanliness of the body was itself a form of evidence, indicating premeditation and an understanding of police investigative techniques. The hemicorporectomy, the bisection of the body at the waist, had been performed at the L2, L3 vertebrae. The cut was clean, passing through soft tissue and between vertebrae rather than through bone. This detail would fuel extensive speculation about the killer's medical knowledge and professional background. The bisection appeared surgical in its precision, executed with an understanding of human anatomy that seemed to exceed what a layperson might possess. Dr. Newbarr's official finding was more conservative. The cut, while clean, did not necessarily indicate surgical training. The separation of the body at the waist could be accomplished by anyone with basic anatomical knowledge and the proper tools. A sharp knife, time, and a willingness to work methodically through tissue and cartilage would be sufficient. The precision of the cut might equally reflect the killer's psychological state, a need for control and order that expressed itself through careful mutilation, rather than professional medical training. The media, however, seized upon the surgical angle immediately. Evening editions on January 16 carried headlines speculating about Dr. Killers and surgical precision. The Examiner quoted unnamed medical experts who insisted the bisection could only have been performed by someone with surgical training. The Herald Express went further, suggesting the killer might be a surgeon or medical student who had access to facilities where such an act could be performed without detection. Dr. Newbarr cautioned against these assumptions. In communications with the LAPD Detective Division, he emphasized that the appearance of surgical skill did not constitute evidence of surgical training. The interpretation of the wounds as expert or professional was subjective and potentially misleading. The investigation should not limit itself to suspects with medical backgrounds based solely on the method of bisection. The police ignored this caution. The visual impact of the bisection, combined with media speculation and public fascination with the idea of a killer with medical training, proved too compelling to resist. By January 17, the investigative focus had already begun to narrow towards suspects with connections to the medical profession, a direction that would consume thousands of investigative hours while potentially overlooking suspects who lacked those credentials but possessed the psychological capacity and opportunity to commit the crime. The autopsy report also documented numerous other injuries and findings. There were signs of sexual assault, though the condition of the body made definitive conclusions difficult. There were rope burns on the neck that suggested strangulation had been attempted but was not the cause of death. There were bruises in various stages of healing, suggesting Elizabeth Short had suffered physical abuse in the days or weeks before her death, though whether from her eventual killer or from other sources could not be determined from the physical evidence alone. The toxicology findings were negative. Elizabeth Short had not been drugged or poisoned. She had been conscious and aware during at least the initial phases of her torture, a realization that added another layer of horror to an already horrific crime. The complete autopsy report, when assembled with all supporting documentation and photographic evidence, ran to over 50 pages. The photographs, which would remain sealed for decades before being released under Freedom of Information requests, documented every injury, every mark, every detail of the body's condition. They were clinical, necessary, and profoundly disturbing. The report's conclusions separated medical fact from speculation. Cause of death, hemorrhage and shock. Manner of death, homicide. Time of death, estimated between January 13 and January 15, based on the condition of the body and the degree of rigor mortis present at the time of discovery. Location of death, unknown, but certainly not the vacant lot where the body was found. Beyond these facts, Dr. Newbarr refused to speculate. The killer's identity, motivation, professional background, and psychological state were matters for police investigation, not medical determination. The autopsy provided evidence. The interpretation of that evidence, the construction of investigative theories, and the ultimate identification of the killer would have to emerge from detective work rather than pathological findings. But the separation between medical fact and press fiction had already been breached. By the time Dr. Newbarr's report was complete, the narrative of the surgical killer had taken root in public consciousness. The investigation would pursue that narrative despite the lack of supporting evidence, a decision that would shape the case's trajectory for months to come. Chapter 3: The First Working Theory. The period between January 17 and January 20 represented a critical juncture in the investigation, the window during which the LAPD's Detective Division formulated its initial working theory about the killer's identity and methodology. This theory, once established, would prove remarkably resistant to revision despite mounting evidence that contradicted its foundational assumptions. The theory emerged from a combination of autopsy findings, media speculation, and institutional bias toward explanations that seemed to match the perceived sophistication of the crime. On January 17, less than 48 hours after the body's discovery and before any systematic canvassing of potential witnesses or suspects had been completed, the LAPD publicly announced that the killer likely possessed medical knowledge. The announcement came during a press briefing attended by reporters from all major Los Angeles newspapers and radio stations. The detective in charge of the briefing, whose name appeared in multiple newspaper accounts, stated with apparent confidence that the precision of the body's bisection indicated someone with surgical training or extensive anatomical knowledge. He suggested the department would be focusing investigative resources on doctors, medical students, surgical residents, and others with access to medical facilities and training. The statement was presented as fact rather than speculation. There was no acknowledgement of Dr. Newbarr's caution against assuming medical expertise based solely on the appearance of the wounds. There was no mention of alternative explanations for the killer's methodology. The theory was stated, and by virtue of being stated by official sources to an eager press, it became the dominant narrative. The detective division's focus narrowed accordingly. Teams of investigators began compiling lists of individuals with medical backgrounds in the Los Angeles area. Medical schools were contacted for rosters of current and former students. Hospitals were asked to identify surgical staff and residents. Morgues and funeral homes, which employed individuals with knowledge of human anatomy and access to tools suitable for body dismemberment, also came under scrutiny. The lists were extensive. Los Angeles in 1947 was home to multiple medical schools, dozens of hospitals, and hundreds of physicians in private practice. When the scope expanded to include medical students, former students who had not completed their training, military medics returning from the war, and mortuary workers, the potential suspect pool numbered in the thousands. The investigative approach was methodical but fundamentally flawed. Each individual identified through medical background was subjected to a preliminary investigation. Detectives checked alibis, looked for connections to Elizabeth Short, and attempted to identify anyone whose behavior or history suggested capacity for extreme violence. The process consumed enormous resources and generated mountains of paperwork, but it operated from an unproven assumption about the killer's professional credentials. What evidence actually existed to support the medical knowledge theory? The bisection of the body, which appeared clean and precise. That was the entirety of the evidentiary foundation. The cut had been made between vertebrae rather than through bone, suggesting anatomical awareness. But as Dr. Newbarr had noted, such awareness did not require formal medical training. Anyone with access to anatomical texts, which were available in public libraries, or anyone who had participated in the butchering of large animals could possess sufficient knowledge to accomplish the bisection. The theory also failed to account for alternative explanations. The precision of the cut might reflect the killer's psychological state rather than professional training. Individuals with certain psychiatric conditions often demonstrate compulsive attention to detail and order, even when engaged in chaotic or violent behavior. The careful bisection, the washing of the body, the positioning at the dump site, all suggested a mind that required control and precision. That requirement could emerge from pathology as easily as from professional training. Transportation theory developed in parallel with the medical knowledge theory. The condition of the body, particularly the complete drainage of blood and the thorough washing, indicated the murder had occurred indoors in a location where the killer had time, privacy, and access to water and drainage. The body had then been transported to the vacant lot for disposal. This element of the theory was well supported by physical evidence. The vacant lot showed no signs of blood or biological material that would have been present if the murder and mutilation had occurred on site. The body's cleanliness suggested washing in a bathtub or similar facility. The killer had therefore required access to a private space, likely a residence, and transportation capable of moving the body from that space to the disposal site. The transportation requirement suggested certain characteristics about the killer. He likely owned or had regular access to a vehicle. The body had been moved in 2 pieces, but even so, the transport would have required a vehicle with sufficient cargo space and privacy to prevent observation. A sedan with a trunk, a panel van, or a truck would fit the requirements. Public transportation could be ruled out. The killer had not carried the body through streets or onto a bus. The location of the disposal site also provided information. South Norton Avenue at 39th Street was not a random choice. The vacant lot was visible from surrounding houses, but the early morning hours of January 15 would have provided sufficient darkness for body placement without immediate observation. The killer had either known the area well enough to identify it as suitable, or had scouted locations in advance. This suggested either local residence or deliberate planning, possibly both. But while the transportation theory received investigative attention, it remained subordinate to the medical knowledge angle. The resources devoted to canvassing the neighborhood around the disposal site were minimal compared to those expended on investigating medical professionals. No systematic effort was made to identify everyone who lived within a mile of South Norton Avenue. No comprehensive check was conducted of vehicle registrations in the immediate area. The vacant lot was treated as incidental to the crime rather than potentially significant in identifying the killer. What got excluded from consideration during this formative period was as significant as what received focus. The domestic violence theory, which might have suggested examining Elizabeth Short's recent relationships for signs of escalating abuse, was dismissed quickly. The injuries inflicted were considered too extreme, too calculated to fit the pattern of domestic homicide as it was understood in 1947. Domestic violence, in the investigative thinking of the time, involved impulsive acts of rage, blunt force trauma, strangulation in moments of loss of control. The torture and mutilation of Elizabeth Short suggested premeditation and psychological abnormality that seemed inconsistent with the domestic violence model. This dismissal reflected both the limitations of 1947 forensic psychology and a fundamental misunderstanding of how domestic violence could escalate. The assumption that domestic violence was impulsive and that calculated torture indicated a stranger killer ignored the reality that intimate partners could engage in prolonged, sadistic abuse that escalated to murder. The ligature marks indicating extended restraint, the injuries in various stages of healing documented in the autopsy, the level of control exercised over the victim, all could have been interpreted as consistent with an abusive relationship that had culminated in murder. The opportunistic offender theory received even less consideration. This theory would have suggested a killer who encountered Elizabeth Short by chance, through a bar meeting or street interaction, and seized an opportunity for violence. The planned nature of the crime, the location required for the murder and mutilation, the careful disposal of the body, all seemed to contradict random opportunity. The investigation therefore focused on finding someone who had known Elizabeth Short, or who had targeted her specifically based on some characteristic or behavior that attracted the killer's attention. Neighborhood canvassing, which might have identified witnesses who saw vehicles in the area during the likely disposal window, was not prioritized. The resources that might have been devoted to systematic door-to-door interviews within a half-mile radius of the disposal site were instead directed toward investigating medical professionals miles away. Potential witnesses who might have seen something relevant went unidentified and uninterviewed. The establishment of the medical knowledge theory as the investigation's primary direction represented a critical narrowing of focus. In the abstract, focusing investigative resources makes sense. Police departments have limited personnel and time. Pursuing every possible angle simultaneously is impractical. Some prioritization is necessary. But effective prioritization requires evidence-based decision-making. The medical knowledge theory was not evidence-based. It emerged from visual assessment of wounds, media speculation, and investigative bias toward explanations that seemed to match the crime's perceived sophistication. It was embraced before alternative theories were seriously explored, before the evidentiary foundation was tested, before the practical implications of narrowing the suspect pools so dramatically were fully considered. By January 20, the theory had calcified into departmental consensus. Detectives were investigating doctors. The press was reporting on the search for a surgical killer. The public was imagining a medical professional who used his knowledge for horrific ends. And the investigation had committed to a direction that would prove extraordinarily difficult to reverse, even as evidence accumulated that contradicted its fundamental assumptions. The tunnel vision was forming, and it was forming early. The case was not yet a week old, the investigative foundation was still being established, witness interviews were ongoing, and yet the working theory had already narrowed possibilities in ways that would haunt the investigation for months. The killer, whoever he was, had succeeded in creating a crime scene that suggested one explanation while possibly being someone entirely different. And the LAPD, eager for direction and vulnerable to the seductive appeal of the surgical killer narrative, had committed to pursuing that explanation before the investigation had properly stabilized. Chapter 4: The Press Takes Over. The relationship between law enforcement and the press in 1947 Los Angeles was fundamentally different from what would emerge in later decades. There were no media relations protocols, no carefully managed information releases, no understanding of how press coverage could contaminate witness memory or compromise investigations. The police and newspapers operated in a state of mutual dependence. Police needed press coverage to generate leads and demonstrate progress to the public, while newspapers needed police access to generate the crime stories that sold papers. This symbiotic relationship, already problematic under normal circumstances, became actively destructive in the Elizabeth Short case. The murder had every element that newspaper editors valued: a young, attractive victim, bizarre and shocking violence, mystery regarding the killer's identity, and enough salacious detail to justify extensive coverage while maintaining a veneer of legitimate public interest. The case was, in the parlance of newspaper circulation departments, a gift. The two dominant newspapers in Los Angeles, the Examiner and the Herald-Express, were both owned by William Randolph Hearst. They competed aggressively despite common ownership. Their editors and reporters engaged in a constant circulation battle that rewarded sensationalism and punished restraint. The Elizabeth Short murder became the battlefield for this competition, with each paper striving to outdo the other in coverage, speculation, and the generation of new angles on the story. The Examiner fired the first major salvo by coining the nickname that would define the case for the next 7 decades. On January 17, the paper published a front-page story referring to the victim as the Black Dahlia. The name was a reference to the film, The Blue Dahlia, which had been released the previous year and had achieved significant popularity. Elizabeth Short, according to the Examiner's account, had worn black clothing and had been nicknamed the Black Dahlia by people who knew her. The accuracy of this claim was questionable at best. Some of Elizabeth Short's acquaintances would later confirm that she often wore black, but none recalled her being known by the Black Dahlia nickname before her death. The name appeared to be a creation of the Examiner's newsroom, a piece of branding designed to make the story more memorable and more marketable. It worked. Within days, Every newspaper in Los Angeles was using the nickname. Within weeks, it had spread nationally. Within months, it was the primary way the case was referenced in public discourse. The press's influence extended far beyond nickname creation. Police leaks, both official and unofficial, ensured that newspapers had access to details about the investigation that should have remained confidential. Autopsy findings, crime scene observations, witness statements, and investigative theories all found their way into print, often within hours of being generated. The leaks served multiple purposes from the police perspective. They kept the case in public view, which maintained pressure for its resolution and demonstrated departmental action. They generated tips from readers who might have information. And they allowed police to float theories and observe public response, using newspaper coverage as a form of informal focus group for investigative directions. But the cost of these leaks was severe. Witnesses who read newspaper accounts before being interviewed had their memories contaminated by published details. When detectives asked what someone had seen or heard, the response might reflect genuine memory or might reflect information absorbed from newspaper coverage. Separating the two became increasingly difficult as the press coverage intensified. Timelines became confused. A witness might remember an event occurring on a specific date because that's when the newspaper reported it, not because that's when their genuine memory placed it. Details became conflated. Someone might report seeing Elizabeth Short wearing specific clothing because the newspaper had described that clothing, not because they actually remembered it. The unconscious incorporation of published information into personal memory is a well-documented phenomenon, but it was poorly understood in 1947, and no systematic effort was made to interview witnesses before they could be exposed to press coverage. False details entered official police notes because detectives, themselves reading newspaper coverage, incorporated published information into their understanding of the case. A detective might include a detail in a report because it had been published in the Examiner, assuming it had come from another detective's work, when in fact it had originated from press speculation or misunderstanding. The contamination was circular and self-reinforcing. The most notorious act of press misconduct occurred on January 16, the same day Dr. Newbarr was conducting the autopsy. An Examiner reporter, whose name would become infamous among journalism ethics instructors for decades afterward, telephoned Elizabeth Short's mother in Massachusetts. The reporter did not identify himself as a journalist. Instead, he claimed to be calling from the Los Angeles Police Department with good news. Elizabeth had won a beauty contest, and the caller needed some background information for the publicity materials. Elizabeth Short's mother, Phoebe Short, was a widow who had lost contact with her daughter in recent months. The call seemed to confirm that Elizabeth was alive and achieving the kind of success she had sought in California. Phoebe Short answered the reporter's questions freely, providing details about Elizabeth's childhood, her family background, her relationships, her aspirations, and her struggles. The conversation lasted over an hour, with the reporter gathering enough material for multiple feature stories. Only after extracting this information did the reporter reveal the truth. Elizabeth was dead, murdered under circumstances so brutal that the details were dominating Los Angeles news coverage. Phoebe Short's reaction was documented by neighbors who heard her screams. The emotional trauma of learning about her daughter's death in this manner, after being deceived into discussing Elizabeth's life with enthusiasm and hope, added another layer of cruelty to an already horrific crime. The Examiner published the resulting stories with prominent bylines and self-congratulatory framing about the paper's investigative efforts. The ethical breach was not acknowledged, let alone apologized for. The information obtained through deception was treated as legitimate journalism, and other papers, not wanting to be scooped on biographical details, repeated the information without questioning its source. The consequences of press coverage extended into the investigative process itself. Detectives, reading newspaper speculation about surgical skill and medical knowledge, found their own thinking shaped by these narratives. The coverage created expectation and pressure. The public now expected the killer to be someone with medical training, and the investigation needed to pursue that angle to demonstrate responsiveness to public concern. Witnesses who might have come forward with information were discouraged by the circus atmosphere surrounding the case. The vacant lot at South Norton and 39th became a tourist attraction, with curiosity seekers visiting the site and collecting dirt as souvenirs. Anyone who had legitimate information about the case risked being drawn into the media spectacle, their names published, their statements dissected in print, their lives subjected to public scrutiny. Some chose silence over exposure. The press also generated false leads that consumed investigative resources. When a newspaper published speculation about a specific angle or potential suspect, tips would flood in supporting that angle, not because the tips had evidentiary value but because readers had absorbed the newspaper's narrative and were reporting information that seemed to confirm it. Detectives had to pursue these tips, if only to eliminate them, and the volume was overwhelming. By late January, the press coverage had achieved a state of self-sustaining momentum. Newspapers didn't need police leaks to generate stories because they could report on their own previous reporting, on public reaction to the case, on the theories being debated in letters to the editor. The Elizabeth Short murder had become not just a crime story but a cultural phenomenon, and the press was both documenting and creating that phenomenon simultaneously. The competition between papers led to increasingly aggressive tactics. Reporters interviewed anyone who had known Elizabeth Short, no matter how tangentially. Her roommates, her casual acquaintances, people who had served her in restaurants or seen her at bus stations, all found themselves quoted in newspapers, their observations magnified into significance whether or not they possessed actual investigative value. Some of these interviews produced genuinely useful information that advanced the investigation. But the information came mixed with speculation, rumor, and outright fabrication from sources who enjoyed the attention or who had their own agendas. Separating valuable leads from noise became a full-time occupation for detectives who should have been pursuing actual suspects. The press also began publishing theories about the killer's motivation and methodology, often framed as coming from experts or sources close to the investigation. These theories ranged from the plausible to the absurd, but all received prominent coverage because they provided new angles for stories. The killer was a sexual deviant. The killer was seeking revenge for some perceived wrong. The killer was mentally ill. The killer was a professional criminal. Each theory generated days of coverage, follow-up speculation, and tips from readers who believed they had information supporting that particular explanation. The media contamination of the investigation was not universal. Some reporters maintained professional standards, verified information before publishing, and resisted the pressure to sensationalize. Some editors imposed restraint on coverage, recognizing that the newspaper's role should be to inform rather than to inflame. But these voices were minority positions in a media environment that rewarded aggressive coverage and punished restraint. By the end of January, the press had become an active participant in the investigation rather than an observer of it. Newspapers were generating leads, shaping investigative direction, influencing witness memory, and creating public pressure that affected how detectives allocated their time and resources. The investigation was no longer purely a police matter. It had become a collaborative effort between law enforcement and media, with all the dysfunction that such collaboration implied. The legacy of this press involvement would extend far beyond the immediate investigation. Future coverage of the case would build on the foundations laid in January 1947, repeating the same details, many of questionable accuracy, that had been published in those first weeks. The Black Dahlia nickname would outlive everyone involved in the original investigation. The theories promoted in newspaper coverage would be recycled in books, documentaries, and articles for the next 7 decades. The press had not just reported on the Elizabeth Short case, it had shaped the case into a form that would prove remarkably resistant to factual correction or nuanced understanding. Chapter 5: The Flood of Confessions. The phenomenon of false confession to high-profile crimes is well documented in criminal psychology, but the scale of false confessions in the Elizabeth Short case exceeded anything in the LAPD's previous experience. Between late January and the end of February 1947, more than 60 individuals came forward to confess to the murder. Some walked into police stations. Some called on telephones. Some wrote letters providing detailed accounts of how they had killed the young woman whose face now appeared daily in newspapers across the country. The first confession arrived within 48 hours of the body's discovery. A middle-aged man presented himself at a police station claiming responsibility for the murder. He provided a rambling account of meeting Elizabeth Short at a bar, taking her to a hotel, and killing her in a fit of rage when she rejected his advances. The story was internally inconsistent and contradicted known facts about the crime, but it required investigation nonetheless. Detectives spent hours interviewing the confessor, checking his alibi, and ultimately determining that he had been in custody on unrelated charges during the period when the murder occurred. The pattern repeated itself with numbing regularity. Each confession demanded response. Police could not simply dismiss individuals who claimed to have committed murder, even when the claims seemed obviously false. Every confessor had to be interviewed, their stories checked against evidence, their alibis verified or disproved, their mental state assessed. The process consumed extraordinary resources at precisely the moment when those resources were most desperately needed for legitimate investigative work. The confessors fell into recognizable categories. The largest group consisted of individuals with mental illness, people whose grasp on reality was tenuous enough that they could genuinely believe they had committed a crime they had only read about in newspapers. These individuals often provided elaborate narratives that incorporated details from press coverage while adding fantastical elements that immediately identified the confession as false. One man claimed to have killed Elizabeth Short on orders from God. Another insisted he had dismembered the body while in a trance state induced by radio waves. The mentally ill confessors were tragic figures, people suffering from conditions that in 1947 were poorly understood and inadequately treated. The attention they received from their confessions, the hours of interrogation and the temporary status as potentially significant suspects, may have provided a brief respite from their usual invisibility. But the interrogations were also cruel in their own way, encouraging delusional individuals to elaborate on false narratives that reinforced their psychological problems. The second category consisted of attention seekers, individuals whose lives felt so insignificant that claiming responsibility for a notorious murder seemed preferable to continued obscurity. These confessors were often more coherent than the mentally ill group, but their stories still contained obvious inconsistencies. They knew details that had been published in newspapers but could not answer questions about aspects of the crime that had been withheld from press coverage. Detectives developed interrogation techniques designed to separate false confessions from potentially genuine ones. They would ask about specific details that had not been made public, the exact position of the body's hands, the specific location of certain injuries, the presence or absence of items at the crime scene that had been intentionally excluded from press reports. A genuine confessor should know these details. False confessors, no matter how convinced they were of their own guilt, could not provide accurate answers to questions about facts they had no way of knowing. Every false confessor failed these tests. But administering the tests required time, and with 60-plus confessors, the cumulative investment became staggering. Detectives who should have been interviewing witnesses, checking alibis of actual suspects, and following legitimate leads instead found themselves conducting elaborate interrogations designed to disprove confessions they knew were almost certainly false. The third category of confessors consisted of former soldiers. The end of World War II had been recent enough that Los Angeles was full of veterans struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. Some had experienced combat trauma that left them psychologically damaged. Some had committed acts of violence during the war that haunted them and made them believe they were capable of any atrocity. When they read about the Elizabeth Short murder, with its overtones of sadistic violence and careful planning, some saw a reflection of themselves or feared they might have committed the crime during a blackout or dissociative episode. These veterans' confessions were particularly time-consuming to investigate because they often came from men whose military records documented genuine capacity for violence and whose service-related psychological problems were verified by medical records. Detectives had to take their claims seriously even when the specifics of their confessions didn't align with case facts. Multiple man-days would be invested in tracking down a veteran's movements during the relevant time period, interviewing his associates, and ultimately concluding that despite his psychological struggles, he had not murdered Elizabeth Short. Some confessors appeared motivated by self-destructive impulses. These were individuals who wanted to be arrested and punished, though not necessarily for the murder they were confessing to. Some were guilty of other crimes and saw the notoriety of the Black Dahlia case as a form of achieving infamy that might satisfy psychological needs that their actual offenses could not address. Others seemed to be seeking punishment for generalized guilt or shame that had no specific object. Confessing to a terrible crime and being imprisoned for it might provide a concrete explanation for feelings of worthlessness that otherwise had no clear source. The geographic range of the confessors was remarkable. While most were local to Los Angeles, confessions arrived from across the country. A man in New York confessed by telegram. A transient in Texas turned himself in to local police claiming he had traveled from Los Angeles after committing the murder. Each out-of-state confession triggered communication between jurisdictions, verification of travel records, and coordination of interrogations. The resources consumed expanded beyond the LAPD to include law enforcement agencies nationwide. 2 confessions stood out for the detail they provided and the investigative effort they required. The first came from a man who claimed to have disposed of Elizabeth Short's body in the ocean before changing his mind and retrieving it for placement in the vacant lot. His story included specific details about the weight of the body, the difficulty of transportation, and the emotional state he experienced while handling the remains. The narrative was compelling enough that detectives spent days checking his background, interviewing his associates, and examining his vehicle for evidence of body transportation. The investigation ultimately revealed that the confessor had read extensive press coverage and had constructed his narrative by combining published details with his own imagination. He had never met Elizabeth Short. He had never been to the vacant lot at South Norton and 39th. His detailed knowledge of the crime came entirely from newspapers, and his confession was motivated by a complex mixture of attention-seeking and genuine mental disturbance that made him believe, at least partially, in the truth of his own story. The second significant false confession came from a man who claimed jealousy as his motive. He insisted that he had been romantically involved with Elizabeth Short, that she had betrayed him with another man, and that he had killed her in a rage that transformed into calculated mutilation as his anger grew. The story had psychological plausibility, it matched certain investigative theories about the personal nature of the crime, and it came from a man whose background check revealed a history of violence toward women. Detectives invested weeks in this confession. They traced the confessor's movements, interviewed everyone who knew him, searched his residence for evidence, and subjected him to multiple interrogation sessions. The investigation eventually determined that he had never met Elizabeth Short. His claimed romantic relationship was entirely fabricated. His knowledge of her came from newspaper photographs and stories. His history of violence toward women made him believe he was capable of the murder and perhaps made him want to claim responsibility for it, but he had not committed the crime. The cumulative effect of these false confessions was investigative paralysis. The LAPD's detective division had finite resources. Every hour spent interrogating a false confessor was an hour not spent pursuing legitimate leads. Every detective assigned to check a confessor's alibi was a detective unavailable for witness interviews or suspect surveillance. The sheer volume of confessions created a bureaucratic nightmare of documentation, cross-referencing, and case file management. Legitimate tips became buried in the flood of false confessions. When a genuine witness called with information about suspicious activity near the disposal site, their tip entered a system overwhelmed with false claims. The prioritization of which leads to pursue became increasingly difficult as the volume of incoming information exceeded the department's capacity to process it systematically. The press, meanwhile, continued to report on the confessions, often in ways that encouraged more. Headlines about "New Suspect in Black Dahlia Case" or "Man Claims Responsibility for Brutal Murder" provided exactly the attention that many confessors sought. The cycle was self-perpetuating. Press coverage generated confessions, which generated more press coverage, which generated more confessions. By the end of February, detectives had developed a dark humor about the phenomenon. They joked that the murder must have had 60 accomplices given how many people claimed responsibility. They created informal betting pools about how many confessions would arrive each week. The humor was a coping mechanism for the frustration of watching their investigation drown in false information while the actual killer remained unidentified and free. The false confession phenomenon also had a more insidious effect on investigative morale and public perception. When the press reported that yet another confession had been disproved, it created an impression of investigative failure. The public saw a police department that couldn't seem to solve a case despite people literally walking in and confessing to it. The reality was more complex. The confessions were obstacles rather than opportunities, barriers to investigation rather than solutions. But that nuance was lost in coverage that presented each disproved confession as another example of police inability to make progress. Chapter 6, Elizabeth Short Under Surveillance. As the false confessions accumulated and the investigation of medical professionals consumed resources without producing viable suspects, the Detective Division shifted its focus toward understanding Elizabeth Short herself. This phase, which began in earnest in late January and continued through February, represented an attempt to construct a victimology profile that might point toward the killer. The underlying theory was sound: understanding the victim's life, movements, associations, and behavior patterns might reveal who had opportunity and motive to kill her. The execution of this victimology phase, however, revealed institutional biases that would ultimately damage the investigation while inflicting posthumous harm on Elizabeth Short's reputation. What began as legitimate detective work gradually transformed into a moralistic judgment of the victim's lifestyle, with investigative conclusions increasingly shaped by 1947 attitudes toward female sexuality and propriety rather than by evidence relevant to identifying her killer. The retracing of Elizabeth Short's movements began systematically. Detectives compiled a timeline of her activities in the weeks and months before her death. She had moved between San Diego and Los Angeles multiple times, traveling by bus and staying at various hotels and rooming houses. She had maintained contact with a network of friends and acquaintances, mostly young women in similar circumstances, and had socialized at restaurants, bars, and other public venues where young people gathered in post-war Los Angeles. The Biltmore Hotel emerged as a significant location. Multiple witnesses reported seeing Elizabeth Short in the hotel's lobby in the days before her disappearance. The Biltmore was a respectable establishment in downtown Los Angeles, known for its elegant architecture and its role as a meeting place for business travelers and local residents alike. Elizabeth Short had apparently used the lobby as a place to meet friends and acquaintances, a common practice in an era when many young women lived in rooming houses that didn't provide adequate space for socializing. The Crown Grill, a restaurant near the Biltmore, was another location where witnesses reported seeing Elizabeth Short. She had apparently been a semi-regular customer, dining alone or with friends, engaging in the kind of casual socializing that characterized young adult life in the city. Detectives interviewed staff at the Crown Grill, seeking information about who Elizabeth Short had met, what conversations she had engaged in, and whether anyone had shown unusual interest in her. The bus terminal records provided information about Elizabeth Short's travel patterns. She had made multiple trips between San Diego and Los Angeles, usually traveling alone, carrying minimal luggage. The frequency of her travel suggested she maintained connections in both cities, moving between them based on work opportunities, living arrangements, or social circumstances that remained unclear even after extensive investigation. Interviews with friends and acquaintances revealed a picture of a young woman struggling to establish herself in California. Elizabeth Short had ambitions in the entertainment industry, a common aspiration among young women who migrated to Los Angeles in that era. She had worked various temporary jobs but had not achieved stable employment or income. She had relied on friends for housing, staying in various apartments and rooming houses, moving frequently when circumstances required. Her wardrobe, by multiple accounts, consisted largely of black clothing, which she wore consistently enough that it became a recognizable characteristic. These biographical details were investigatively relevant. They established Elizabeth Short's social circle, identified people who might have information about her final days, and created a framework for understanding who had access to her. But as the investigation progressed, the tone of police reports began to shift in ways that reflected judgment rather than neutral documentation. Police reports increasingly emphasized Elizabeth Short's clothing choices, particularly the black garments that had inspired the Black Dahlia nickname. The reports described her appearance in terms that suggested moral assessment rather than physical description. She was described as attractive, but also as dressing in ways that attracted attention. The reports noted that she frequented bars and restaurants where she met men, with the implication that such behavior was inappropriate or suggestive of moral laxity. The investigation of Elizabeth Short's sexual history became disproportionately detailed. Detectives interviewed associates about her romantic relationships, her dating behavior, and rumors about her sexual activity. The autopsy had documented evidence of sexual assault associated with the murder, but the investigative focus on Elizabeth Short's consensual sexual history went far beyond what was relevant to understanding that assault. Some reports suggested that Elizabeth Short had engaged in casual relationships with multiple men. Others reported rumors, often unverified, about her involvement in prostitution or other forms of sex work. These reports were documented with a level of detail and emphasis that contrasted sharply with the relatively cursory treatment of other investigative angles. The implication, sometimes stated explicitly and other times merely suggested, was that Elizabeth Short's lifestyle had contributed to her vulnerability or had somehow invited the violence that had ended her life. This shift in investigative tone reflected broader social attitudes in 1947 America. Young women who moved to cities alone, who socialized in public venues, who dated multiple men, and who dressed in ways considered provocative were viewed with suspicion and moral disapproval. The concept that a woman's sexual behavior or lifestyle choices might make her partially responsible for violence committed against her was not yet recognized as victim blaming. It was instead considered legitimate context for understanding criminal behavior. The damage done by this investigative approach was multifaceted. First, it created a framework in which leads were dismissed based on moral judgments rather than evidentiary value. If a detective believed that Elizabeth Short's lifestyle had attracted criminal attention, they might prioritize investigating men she had dated or socialized with while dismissing the possibility that her killer was someone with no social connection to her. The investigation became focused on finding someone from Elizabeth Short's world rather than considering that the killer might have targeted her precisely because she was vulnerable, transient, and unlikely to have protective social connections. Second, the emphasis on Elizabeth Short's sexual behavior eroded public sympathy in ways that affected the investigation's public support. Early press coverage had portrayed Elizabeth Short as an innocent victim of terrible violence. As details about her lifestyle emerged, often through police leaks to reporters, the narrative shifted. Some coverage began to suggest that Elizabeth Short had been involved in risky behavior that had predictable consequences. The implication that she bore some responsibility for her own murder was never stated explicitly, but it permeated the tone of later reporting. This erosion of sympathy had practical effects. Witnesses who might have come forward with information were discouraged by the narrative that Elizabeth Short had been that kind of girl. The investigation began to be seen not as a search for justice for an innocent victim but as an attempt to resolve the unfortunate consequences of a young woman's poor choices. The distinction was subtle but significant in terms of public engagement and willingness to assist police efforts. Third, the moralistic focus distracted from legitimate investigative questions about Elizabeth Short's vulnerability. She had been transient, living in temporary housing and moving frequently between cities. She had limited financial resources and had relied on a network of casual acquaintances for support. She had been socially isolated in ways that made her an ideal victim for a predator who sought someone unlikely to be immediately missed or vigorously searched for. These vulnerability factors were investigatively relevant not because they suggested moral failing but because they might help identify the type of offender who had targeted her. Predators often select victims based on perceived vulnerability. Understanding Elizabeth Short's social isolation, her transience, and her economic precarity might have pointed toward a killer who specifically sought victims with those characteristics. But the investigation's focus on moral judgment obscured these practical considerations. The interviews with Elizabeth Short's associates also revealed information about her final days that should have received more investigative attention than it did. Several people reported that Elizabeth Short had seemed nervous or frightened in the week before her disappearance. One friend recalled her mentioning that she needed to meet someone but seemed reluctant about the meeting. Another remembered Elizabeth Short making a comment about having gotten involved in something she regretted and wanting to extricate herself. These fragments of information suggested that Elizabeth Short had been aware of danger, that she might have been coerced or threatened, that her death might have resulted from a specific situation rather than random predation. But these leads were not pursued with the vigor that characterized the investigation of her sexual history. The emphasis remained on documenting her lifestyle rather than investigating the specific circumstances that had led to her murder. By the end of February, the victimology phase had produced a massive file of information about Elizabeth Short's life but had not significantly advanced the investigation toward identifying her killer. Detectives knew where she had traveled, who she had socialized with, where she had worked, and extensive details about her personal relationships. What they had not developed was a viable theory about which of these people might have murdered her or whether her killer came from outside her social circle entirely. The legacy of this investigative phase was a portrait of Elizabeth Short that emphasized moral judgment over factual documentation. Future accounts of the case would repeat the same characterizations, describing her as a troubled young woman whose lifestyle brought her into contact with dangerous people. The possibility that she had been a relatively ordinary young woman, struggling with poverty and transience in ways common to thousands of others, and that she had been targeted by a killer for reasons unrelated to her behavior, would be largely lost in the narrative that emerged from the LAPD's victimology investigation. Chapter 7: Internal Conflict. The LAPD's organizational structure in 1947 included multiple divisions that operated with substantial autonomy. The Homicide Division, the Detective Bureau, and various specialized units all had jurisdiction over different aspects of serious crime investigation. In theory, this division of labor allowed for specialization and expertise. In practice, particularly in a case as complex and high-profile as the Elizabeth Short murder, it created a coordination nightmare that fragmented the investigation and allowed critical information to slip through organizational gaps. Multiple detective teams were assigned to different aspects of the Black Dahlia case. One team focused on the medical professional angle, investigating doctors, medical students, and others with anatomical knowledge. Another team pursued the victimology work, interviewing Elizabeth Short's associates and reconstructing her movements. A third team handled the flood of tips and confessions that continued to arrive daily. A fourth team investigated the crime scene and physical evidence. Each team operated semi-independently, reporting to different supervisors, maintaining separate files, and working from different theoretical frameworks about the nature of the crime. The lack of centralized information management created immediate problems. When one team developed information relevant to another team's work, the communication between them was often delayed or incomplete. A detective investigating Elizabeth Short's social connections might develop information about a specific individual that would be relevant to the team investigating medical professionals, but if that detective filed a report that wasn't immediately cross-referenced with other files, the connection might not be made until weeks later, if at all. The case file itself became unwieldy. Each team generated reports, interview notes, and documentation that were added to the central file without systematic indexing or organization. By mid-February, the file consisted of hundreds of pages of material that no single detective had comprehensive knowledge of. Searching the file for specific information required hours of page-by-page review. Cross-referencing between different reports to identify patterns or contradictions was nearly impossible given the volume and the lack of organizational structure. The detective teams also disagreed fundamentally about the nature of the crime and the likely characteristics of the killer. These disagreements were not merely differences in emphasis or interpretation. They reflected fundamentally incompatible theories about what had happened to Elizabeth Short and who had killed her. One faction believed the crime was deeply personal, that the killer had known Elizabeth Short and had murdered her in response to some relationship between them. This theory was supported by the apparent rage expressed in the facial mutilation and the extended torture indicated by the ligature marks. The crime seemed too emotionally intense to be the work of a stranger. The killer had spent hours with Elizabeth Short before and after her death, suggesting investment that went beyond opportunistic violence. Another faction believed the crime was the work of a stranger who had targeted Elizabeth Short based on her vulnerability or certain characteristics that attracted the killer's attention. This theory emphasized the careful planning evident in the crime, the selection of a disposal site, and the methodical cleaning of the body. These elements suggested calculation and premeditation inconsistent with the impulsive nature of most crimes of passion. The killer, in this view, was someone who hunted for victims and had selected Elizabeth Short for reasons that might have nothing to do with her specific identity. The debate over whether the murder occurred indoors or in a vehicle represented another fundamental disagreement. The absence of blood at the disposal site clearly indicated the murder had occurred elsewhere. But where? One faction argued for an indoor location, likely a residence, where the killer had privacy, time, and access to facilities like a bathtub for blood drainage and body washing. This theory was supported by the extended nature of the crime and the evidence of torture that would have been difficult to conduct in a vehicle. The alternative theory suggested the murder might have occurred in a vehicle, possibly a van or truck equipped in ways that gave the killer a mobile crime scene. This theory was based partly on the lack of progress in identifying an indoor location where the crime might have occurred and partly on the fact that a mobile crime scene would have provided the killer with flexibility and reduced the risk of being tied to a specific location. If the murder had occurred in a van, the killer could have driven to various locations, parked in isolated areas, and conducted the torture and mutilation without the risk of being interrupted by neighbors or family members who might have been present at a residential location. These theoretical disagreements had practical consequences. Resources were allocated based on which theory a particular supervisor found most compelling. If a supervisor believed the crime was personal, detectives under their command focused on Elizabeth Short's social connections. If a supervisor believed the killer was a stranger, resources went toward investigating known sex offenders and individuals with histories of violence against women. The investigation fragmented along these theoretical lines, with different teams pursuing fundamentally incompatible directions. The supervisory structure added another layer of dysfunction. Supervisors faced enormous pressure to demonstrate progress. The case dominated public attention, the press demanded daily updates, and the police chief needed visible action to justify the resources being devoted to the investigation. This pressure translated into demands for briefings, reports, and evidence of forward momentum that often had more to do with public relations than investigative effectiveness. Public briefings became a regular feature of the investigation. Detectives would be pulled from their work to prepare updates for press conferences where supervisors would announce new developments, describe ongoing investigative efforts, and attempt to project confidence in eventual case resolution. These briefings consumed time and energy that could have been devoted to actual investigation. They also created pressure to present information in ways that suggested progress even when little had been made. The briefings also created a feedback loop that reinforced investigative tunnel vision. When a supervisor announced at a press conference that the department was focusing on medical professionals, it became politically difficult to pivot away from that focus even if evidence suggested the theory was unproductive. Changing direction would require acknowledging that previous efforts had been misdirected, an admission that supervisors were reluctant to make given the already intense public scrutiny of the investigation. Internal politics further complicated the investigation. Different divisions within the LAPD had different priorities and different approaches to high-profile cases. Some supervisors saw the Black Dahlia case as an opportunity for career advancement and positioned themselves to claim credit for any breakthroughs. Others recognized the case as a potential disaster that could damage reputations and tried to distance themselves from direct involvement. These political calculations affected how resources were allocated and how aggressively different investigative angles were pursued. The lack of a single lead detective with clear authority over all aspects of the investigation meant that no one had the power to impose coherence on the fragmented efforts. Different teams operated with different theories, different priorities, and different levels of resource commitment. When conflicts arose about investigative direction, they were often resolved through bureaucratic processes that prioritized political considerations over investigative effectiveness. Communication with external agencies was similarly fragmented. When information needed to be exchanged with the FBI, with police departments in other cities, or with county agencies, multiple LAPD divisions might be involved in ways that created confusion about who was responsible for follow-up. Tips that came through FBI channels might be handled differently than tips that came directly to the LAPD. Information from other police departments might be filed in one team's records but not shared with other teams who could benefit from it. The detective assigned nominal leadership of the case, whose name appeared on official reports and press releases, lacked the actual authority to direct all investigative efforts. He could coordinate with other teams, request information, and suggest directions for investigation, but he could not command other divisions to follow his lead or prioritize his requests over their other responsibilities. The investigation was nominally unified but practically fragmented across multiple autonomous units. By early March, the internal conflicts had become severe enough that they were affecting morale among the detectives actually working the case. Investigators who had developed leads through painstaking work found their efforts undermined by lack of follow-up from other teams. Detectives who believed the investigation was pursuing unproductive theories were overruled by supervisors who had committed publicly to those theories. The sense of working at cross purposes, of being part of an investigative effort that lacked coherent direction, created frustration and cynicism that further degraded the investigation's effectiveness. The fragmentation also created opportunities for information to be lost or overlooked. When a witness provided information to one detective team, that information entered the formal record, but whether it was effectively communicated to other teams depended on the specific detective's diligence in cross-referencing and the organizational systems available for information sharing. In several documented cases, witnesses provided similar information to different detective teams weeks apart, suggesting that the teams were not effectively sharing information about who had been interviewed and what they had reported. The lack of centralized leadership and clear authority structure represented a fundamental organizational failure. High-profile investigations require coordination, unified direction, and clear lines of authority. The Black Dahlia case had none of these. Instead, it had multiple teams working parallel tracks, supervisors demanding visible progress, public briefings that reinforced unproductive theories, and internal conflicts that consumed energy and attention that should have been devoted to identifying Elizabeth Short's killer. The fragmentation was not inevitable. Other police departments facing complex investigations had developed organizational structures that provided both specialization and coordination. Task forces with clear leadership, centralized information management, and regular coordination meetings among team leaders could have prevented many of the problems that plagued the Black Dahlia investigation. But the LAPD in 1947 lacked these structures, and the attempt to investigate a complex, high-profile murder through existing organizational channels proved inadequate to the challenge. Chapter 8: Evidence Problems. Physical evidence is the foundation of criminal investigation. Witness testimony can be unreliable, confessions can be false, circumstantial connections can be coincidental. But physical evidence, when properly collected, preserved, and analyzed, provides objective documentation that can survive challenges and support prosecution. The Elizabeth Short case should have generated substantial physical evidence. The crime scene, the victim's body, the disposal site, and the victim's personal belongings all represented potential sources of evidence that could identify the killer or connect a suspect to the crime. Instead, the physical evidence in the Black Dahlia case represented a cascade of failures that began with the contaminated crime scene and continued through every subsequent phase of evidence collection and preservation. By the time the investigation entered its second month, the physical evidence foundation had eroded to the point where even if investigators identified a viable suspect, prosecution would face enormous challenges in proving the case beyond reasonable doubt. The crime scene contamination in the first hour after discovery has already been documented. The footprints, trace evidence, and spatial relationships that might have provided information about the killer's approach and disposal of the body were destroyed before proper crime scene protocols were established. But the evidence problems extended far beyond that initial failure. Elizabeth Short's clothing represented a critical category of missing evidence. When the body was discovered, it was nude. The victim's clothing had been removed, presumably by the killer, and taken from the disposal site. The clothing might have contained evidence of where the murder occurred. Fibers, soil, biological material, or other trace evidence embedded in the fabric could have pointed toward a specific location or environment. Damage to the clothing might have provided information about the sequence of events during the crime. But the clothing was never recovered. Despite extensive searches of the area around the disposal site, despite public appeals for information, despite the intense press coverage that ensured everyone in Los Angeles knew about the case, the clothing never surfaced. The killer had either destroyed it or disposed of it in a location where it would not be found. This represented a significant loss of potential evidence. Elizabeth Short's personal belongings were similarly missing. She had been living a transient life, moving between locations with her possessions in suitcases or bags. Those belongings, which would have included clothing, personal items, possibly photographs or correspondence, disappeared. Friends and acquaintances reported that Elizabeth Short had possessed certain items in the days before her death, but those items were not at the disposal site and were not recovered from any location she had previously stayed. The missing belongings represented another category of lost evidence. Letters or photographs might have identified people in Elizabeth Short's life who had not been discovered through witness interviews. personal items might have provided information about her activities or intentions in the days before her death. The absence of these belongings suggested the killer had either taken them or had access to wherever Elizabeth Short had been staying and had removed them after the murder. Some evidence was collected at the disposal site but was logged without adequate description. The reports from the initial crime scene investigation noted various items found in the vacant lot: cigarette butts, pieces of paper, miscellaneous debris. But the descriptions were vague, and the items were not preserved in ways that would allow later analysis. It was unclear which items had been present before the body was placed and which might have been left by the killer or by the curious onlookers who had contaminated the scene. The cigarette butts, in particular, represented missed opportunity. In 1947, forensic analysis of cigarette butts was limited, but the butts could still provide information about brand preferences and smoking habits that might help identify a suspect. If the killer had smoked while placing the body or had left cigarette butts from a vehicle, those butts might have been among the items collected at the scene. But without adequate documentation and preservation, the potential value of these items was lost. Blood evidence, which in later decades would become central to criminal investigation through DNA analysis, was essentially useless in the Black Dahlia case. The body had been drained of blood and washed. The disposal site showed no blood traces. Whatever blood had been transferred to surfaces during the murder remained at the unknown location where the crime had been committed. Without that location, without the primary crime scene, the blood evidence that might have provided definitive proof of a suspect's involvement was simply unavailable. The 1947 forensic limitations were significant. DNA analysis would not be developed for decades. Blood typing was possible but provided only general categorization rather than individual identification. Fingerprint analysis was well established but required good quality prints from both crime scene and suspect for comparison. Trace evidence analysis existed but was far less sophisticated than it would later become. Even with these limitations, better evidence collection and preservation could have provided material for future analysis. If the crime scene had been properly secured and documented, if items collected had been adequately described and preserved, if systematic searches for the victim's belongings had been more thorough, the evidence base would have been stronger. The investigation failed not because 1947 technology was inadequate but because basic evidence collection and preservation protocols were not followed. The critical issue that would haunt the case for decades was the absence of preserved suspect material. In a murder investigation, physical evidence serves two purposes: it helps identify suspects, and it provides material for comparison when suspects are developed through other means. Even if the initial evidence doesn't point toward a specific individual, preserved evidence can be used to confirm or eliminate suspects as the investigation progresses. The Black Dahlia case lacked this preserved comparison material. When investigators developed a potential suspect weeks or months after the murder, they had limited physical evidence to compare with materials associated with that suspect. They couldn't compare fibers from the disposal site with fibers from the suspect's vehicle or residence because the disposal site had been contaminated. They couldn't compare blood evidence because the body had been washed. They couldn't examine the victim's clothing for trace evidence because the clothing was missing. This evidence gap meant that suspect investigations relied almost entirely on circumstantial connections and witness testimony. Did the suspect know Elizabeth Short? Did the suspect have opportunity to commit the crime? Did witnesses place the suspect with the victim near the time of death? These questions could be investigated, but without physical evidence to support the circumstantial case, prosecution would be nearly impossible even if investigators developed strong suspicions about a particular individual. The evidence problems were compounded by the passage of time. Items that might have been recovered in the first days after the murder became increasingly unlikely to be found as weeks passed. Witnesses whose memories were fresh in January became less reliable in February and March. The contaminated crime scene, which might have been partially reconstructed through careful analysis if done immediately, became impossible to analyze as more time elapsed and more changes occurred at the site. Some evidence was created by the investigation itself, though its value was questionable. Detectives compiled extensive files of witness statements, suspect investigations, and tips. These files documented the investigative process and provided a record of who had been interviewed and what they had reported. But the files also contained speculation, rumor, and information of doubtful reliability mixed with genuine evidence in ways that made it difficult to separate valuable material from noise. The autopsy photographs and Dr. Newbarr's detailed documentation of the body's condition represented the most reliable physical evidence in the case. These materials could not identify the killer, but they provided objective documentation of the injuries and could potentially support or contradict theories about the crime. The photographs would remain sealed for decades, their disturbing nature considered too graphic for public release, but they existed as a permanent record that could be consulted as needed. The lack of physical evidence also affected how the investigation developed theories about the crime. Without material evidence pointing toward specific characteristics of the killer or the crime location, investigators relied more heavily on interpretation of the injuries and speculation about what those injuries revealed about the killer's state of mind or professional background. This created the foundation for the surgical killer theory and other speculative directions that consumed resources without producing results. By March 1947, the evidence situation had been thoroughly assessed and the conclusions were grim. The investigation had abundant documentation about Elizabeth Short's life, extensive files of witness interviews and suspect investigations, and detailed autopsy findings. What it lacked was physical evidence that could identify the killer or provide material for comparison when suspects were developed. The case could potentially be solved through witness testimony or confession, but a physical evidence-based solution was increasingly unlikely. The evidence problems also meant that even if the killer was eventually identified, prosecution might be impossible. The standard for criminal conviction is proof beyond reasonable doubt. Without physical evidence connecting a suspect to the crime, prosecutors would need to rely entirely on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. Defense attorneys could argue that the contaminated crime scene, the missing evidence, and the chaotic initial investigation created enough doubt to prevent conviction. The evidentiary foundation was too weak to support the weight of prosecution. This reality created a paradoxical situation where investigators might eventually identify the killer with reasonable confidence but lack the evidence to prove it in court. The investigation could reach a conclusion in investigative terms while remaining unsolved in legal terms. The killer might be known but never prosecuted, a frustrating outcome that would feed decades of speculation and amateur investigation as people outside law enforcement attempted to fill the gaps that the official investigation could not close. Chapter 9: The Case Goes Cold. The transition from active investigation to cold case is rarely a single moment of decision. There is no press conference announcing that the department is giving up, no internal memo declaring the case unsolvable. Instead, active investigations die slowly, through a process of gradual resource reallocation and declining momentum that reflects institutional assessment of probability of success. The Elizabeth Short case entered this dying phase in spring 1947, barely 3 months after her body had been discovered in the vacant lot at South Norton and 39th. The decline of tips was the first visible sign of the investigation's decay. In January and February, the LAPD had been overwhelmed with information from the public. Tips arrived by telephone, by mail, in person at police stations. Witnesses reported sightings of Elizabeth Short in the days before her death. Informants provided names of potential suspects. Ordinary citizens shared theories about the crime. The volume had been unmanageable, but it had created an impression of public engagement and investigative momentum. By April, the flow of tips had slowed to a trickle. The public had moved on to other concerns. The newspapers had found new crimes to cover. The extraordinary attention that had characterized the first weeks had dissipated, replaced by ordinary levels of interest that couldn't sustain the investigative intensity the case required. Tips still arrived, but they were fewer, less detailed, and often came from individuals whose credibility was questionable. Press interest, which had been so intense in the early weeks, shifted to other stories. Newspapers still mentioned the Black Dahlia case periodically, usually when there was a new development to report or when the anniversary of the discovery approached. But the daily coverage, the front-page headlines, the detailed speculation about suspects and theories, all faded. The case became a reference point rather than a current story, something that had happened rather than something that was happening. The shift in press coverage reflected broader public attention patterns. a sensational crime can dominate public consciousness for only so long before psychological fatigue sets in. The details that had seemed shocking in January became familiar through repetition by March. The public had absorbed the story, formed their opinions about what had happened, and was ready to move on. The Black Dahlia case had become part of Los Angeles lore, a famous unsolved murder that would be remembered and discussed, but it was no longer the urgent, immediate crisis that demanded daily attention. New crimes began to dominate law enforcement resources. Los Angeles in 1947 was a growing city with increasing crime rates that reflected post-war social disruption. Robberies, assaults, and other homicides required police attention. The LAPD's detective division had finite resources, and as the probability of solving the Elizabeth Short case declined, those resources were inevitably redirected toward crimes that seemed more solvable. The resource reallocation was gradual and bureaucratic rather than dramatic. Detectives who had been assigned full-time to the Black Dahlia case were given other assignments that took increasing amounts of their time. The special teams that had been created to handle different aspects of the investigation were disbanded, their members returned to regular duties. The case remained open, technically still under active investigation, but the number of detectives actually working it declined from dozens to a handful, and eventually to whoever caught new tips or developed new leads through other investigative work. The Black Dahlia file remained open but inactive, a large collection of reports, interview notes, photographs, and documentation that sat in police archives waiting for the breakthrough that would justify renewed investigative attention. The file was consulted periodically when new tips came in, when reporters asked questions, or when detectives needed to reference something related to other cases. But systematic investigation, the daily work of pursuing leads and checking alibis and interviewing suspects, had largely ceased. Detectives were reassigned based on the department's assessment of where they could be most effective. The investigators who had developed expertise in the Black Dahlia case found themselves working other homicides, other investigations where their skills could produce results. This was rational resource allocation from the department's perspective, but it had consequences for institutional memory and case continuity. When a tip came in months after the investigation had effectively ended, the detective who caught the tip might have minimal knowledge of the case beyond what was in the file. They would review the relevant documents, attempt to evaluate the tip's credibility and relevance, and decide whether it warranted follow-up investigation. But they lacked the deep familiarity with the case that comes from intensive involvement. Details that an original investigator would immediately recognize as significant might be overlooked by someone encountering the case for the first time through file review. The case was handed off multiple times as detectives retired, transferred to other divisions, or simply moved on to other assignments. Each handoff represented a loss of institutional memory. The informal knowledge that investigators develop, the sense of which leads are promising and which are dead ends, the understanding of which witnesses are reliable and which are not, all of this resided in the minds of the original investigators and was imperfectly transferred through the formal case file. Some detectives who had worked the case intensively in the early months maintained personal interest even after being reassigned. They continued to think about the case, to follow up on information that came their way, to check in periodically on the status of the file. This personal investment represented a form of continuity that partially compensated for the institutional discontinuity of reassignments and handoffs. But it was voluntary and unsystematic rather than formally structured. The erosion of institutional memory meant that certain investigative conclusions, certain assessments of suspects or theories that had been developed through intensive work in the first months, were lost or forgotten. A detective reviewing the file years later might encounter a suspect who had been investigated and eliminated in 1947 but might not have access to all the reasoning that led to that elimination. The result was occasional reinvestigation of theories or suspects that had already been thoroughly examined, a waste of resources that reflected the difficulty of maintaining continuity in a long-term investigation. The case's status as officially open but practically dormant created a strange limbo. The LAPD could not declare the case solved without an arrest and prosecution. The department could not formally close the case without acknowledging defeat. So the case remained open, a permanent entry in the unsolved homicide files, a reminder of investigative failure that could not be quietly forgotten because of its public profile. Periodic attempts to revive the investigation occurred over the following years. When a new police chief took office, there might be a review of major unsolved cases including the Black Dahlia. When a new forensic technique became available, there might be an assessment of whether it could be applied to the evidence. When a particularly credible tip came in, there might be a brief surge of renewed activity. But these revivals were temporary and produced no significant progress toward identifying the killer. The physical evidence, such as it was, remained in storage. The autopsy photographs, the items collected from the disposal site, the documentation of the body's condition, all resided in police archives where they could theoretically be consulted if needed. But without new leads pointing toward a specific suspect, the evidence sat unused, a potential resource that couldn't be activated without investigative direction. The witnesses who had been interviewed in 1947 gradually became less accessible. Some moved away from Los Angeles. Some died. Some simply stopped responding to police inquiries, having told their stories multiple times in the first months and having nothing new to add. The pool of people with direct knowledge of Elizabeth Short's life and activities in the days before her death slowly evaporated as time passed and memories faded. By 1950, 3 years after the murder, the Black Dahlia case had fully entered cold case status. It remained the most famous unsolved murder in Los Angeles history, a case that every detective in the department knew about but that no one was actively working. The file was thick with documentation of the extensive investigation that had been conducted in 1947, but it was also a record of failure, of an investigation that had consumed enormous resources without producing an arrest. The official death of momentum occurred not through formal declaration but through institutional reality. Resources flowed to cases that could be solved. The Black Dahlia case, lacking viable suspects and lacking evidence that could be used to develop new suspects, did not justify continued intensive investigation. The decision was never explicitly made to abandon the case, but the effect was the same. The investigation ended not with resolution but with exhaustion, with the gradual recognition that continued effort was unlikely to produce results that would justify the investment. The case remained open, technically active, always ready to be revived if new information emerged. But practically speaking, the investigation was over. Elizabeth Short's killer, whoever he was, had successfully evaded identification. The crime that had dominated Los Angeles news coverage and consumed thousands of hours of detective work had been added to the list of unsolved mysteries that would define the city's criminal history. Chapter 10: The investigation ends, the myth begins. The transformation of the Elizabeth Short case from active criminal investigation to cultural mythology began even before the investigation had fully entered dormancy. By late 1947, while detectives were still occasionally pursuing leads and the case file remained technically active, the murder had already begun to take on characteristics that distinguished it from ordinary unsolved homicides. The combination of brutal violence, mysterious circumstances, attractive victim, and investigative failure created narrative elements that transcended the specific facts of the crime and entered the realm of story, legend, and cultural obsession. The case entered public imagination in ways that few crimes achieve. Most murders, even unsolved ones, fade from public consciousness relatively quickly. They are documented in police files and occasional true crime compilations, but they don't become reference points in popular culture. The Black Dahlia case was different. It became shorthand for a particular kind of crime, a particular era of Los Angeles history, a particular type of unsolved mystery that captured something essential about post-war American darkness. The elements that made the case memorable were both factual and constructed. The brutality of the murder was undeniable, documented in autopsy reports and crime scene photographs that, while not publicly released, were described in enough detail that the public understood the extreme nature of the violence. The bisection of the body, the facial mutilation, the evidence of torture, all created an image of depravity that exceeded the normal bounds of criminal violence. But the mythology that developed around the case also included elements that were exaggerated, misunderstood, or entirely fabricated. The Black Dahlia nickname, which had been a creation of newspaper branding rather than a name Elizabeth Short had actually used, became her permanent identifier. The suggestion of surgical precision in the murder, which Dr. Newbarr had cautioned against but which the press had promoted, became accepted as fact in popular understanding. The characterization of Elizabeth Short's lifestyle, filtered through 1947 moral judgments and police reports that emphasized her sexuality, became the foundation for narratives that portrayed her as a tragic figure whose choices had contributed to her fate. Amateur investigators began collecting clippings, photographs, and any available information about the case. These were not professional researchers or journalists but ordinary citizens who became obsessed with solving the murder that had stumped the LAPD. They compiled files, developed theories, and in some cases devoted years to investigating suspects or angles that they believed the police had overlooked or inadequately pursued. The amateur investigation phenomenon reflected several cultural currents. The case represented a puzzle that could be approached without specialized training. The basic facts were publicly available through newspaper archives. The investigation had been public enough that many details were known. An amateur with time and determination could potentially develop theories that were as plausible as the official police theories, none of which had led to an arrest. The amateur investigators also filled a need for resolution that the official investigation had failed to provide. The public wanted the case solved, wanted to know who had killed Elizabeth Short and why. When the police couldn't provide answers, amateur investigators stepped in with their own conclusions, their own suspects, their own explanations for what had happened. These alternative theories might lack evidentiary support, but they provided narrative satisfaction that the official investigation's inconclusive ending could not offer. Writers began publishing accounts of the case, each adding their own interpretations and theories. The first books appeared in the 1950s, early attempts to document the crime and investigation for readers who remembered the original news coverage. These early accounts were relatively straightforward, sticking closely to known facts and avoiding excessive speculation. But as time passed and the original events receded into history, later accounts became more speculative, more willing to identify specific suspects, more elaborate in their theories about what had happened. The books created a literary tradition of Black Dahlia investigation that would extend through multiple generations. Each new account claimed to have discovered previously overlooked evidence or to have identified the real killer. Some focused on suspects who had been investigated in 1947 but never charged. Others identified suspects who had not been seriously considered by the original investigation. Still others developed elaborate conspiracy theories that explained the unsolved status as the result of cover-ups or institutional corruption. The identification of suspects by writers and amateur investigators created its own problems. Individuals would be named in books or articles as the probable killer based on circumstantial evidence, speculation, or theories that lacked support from the physical evidence or witness testimony. These accused individuals, or their families if the accused were deceased, would sometimes respond with defamation lawsuits or public rebuttals. But the accusations, once published, became part of the permanent literature of the case, repeated in subsequent accounts even when they had been legally challenged or factually disproved. Some suspects emerged decades after the murder through sensational claims by individuals who alleged that a family member or acquaintance had committed the crime. These claims often came from people who had been children in 1947 and who reported memories or suspicions that they claimed had been suppressed or ignored. The delayed nature of these accusations made them nearly impossible to verify or disprove. Witnesses were dead, evidence was gone, and the passage of time made it difficult to distinguish genuine memory from constructed narrative influenced by decades of exposure to Black Dahlia literature and speculation. The most elaborate of these later accusations came with supporting narratives that explained not just the murder but why the killer had escaped justice. These narratives often involved claims of police corruption, cover-ups by powerful individuals who protected the killer, or institutional decisions to abandon the investigation for political reasons. The conspiracy theories reflected both genuine suspicion about police competence and the narrative need to explain why such an intensely investigated crime had never been solved. The investigation became interpretive rather than evidentiary. Without physical evidence that could definitively identify the killer, without witness testimony that could place a specific suspect at the crime scene, the question of who killed Elizabeth Short became a matter of interpretation rather than proof. Different investigators, professional and amateur, looked at the same limited evidence and reached different conclusions based on their theories about the crime, their assessment of various suspects' credibility, and their understanding of what the known facts suggested about the killer's identity and motivation. This interpretive phase represented a fundamental shift in how the case existed in public consciousness. In the first months after the murder, the case had been an active investigation where the goal was to gather evidence, identify suspects, and build a case that could lead to arrest and prosecution. By the 1950s and beyond, the case had become a historical puzzle where the goal was to construct a plausible narrative using fragmentary evidence and informed speculation. The standards of proof shifted from the legal standard of beyond reasonable doubt to the narrative standard of making sense of the available information. The mythology that developed around the case also reflected changing social attitudes. In 1947, the victim blaming evident in police reports and press coverage reflected contemporary attitudes toward women's sexuality and propriety. By the 1970s and beyond, feminist analysis of the case emphasized the misogyny evident in both the crime and its investigation. The Black Dahlia case became a lens through which cultural attitudes toward violence against women could be examined and critiqued. The case also became emblematic of a particular vision of Los Angeles. The image of a young woman coming to Hollywood with dreams of stardom, falling into a shadowy world of marginalized existence, and ending up murdered and dumped in a vacant lot, captured something essential about the city's self-image as a place where dreams could turn dark. The Black Dahlia case became part of Los Angeles noir, the literary and cultural tradition that emphasized the city's shadows, its violence, its corruption, and the gap between its sunny surface and its darker reality. Multiple films, television episodes, and fictionalized accounts used the case as source material, each adding layers of interpretation and fictional elaboration. These cultural productions were not attempts to solve the crime but rather uses of the case as narrative framework for exploring themes of violence, obsession, and the dark side of American dreams. The real Elizabeth Short and her actual killer became less important than what they represented in cultural imagination. The LAPD's official case file remained, a thick collection of documents that represented the most extensive investigation the department had ever conducted into a single murder. The file was consulted periodically when new theories emerged or when documentary filmmakers sought official information. The department's official position remained that the case was unsolved and that new evidence would be welcomed. But practically speaking, the investigation was long over, ended not by resolution but by exhaustion and institutional acceptance that the crime would remain forever unsolved. The forensic evidence that remained in storage represented a potential resource for future investigation if technology advanced sufficiently to allow new forms of analysis. As DNA testing developed in later decades, there was occasional discussion of whether any material from the case could yield DNA evidence that might identify the killer or confirm or eliminate suspects. But the washing of the body, the absence of preserved biological material from a known suspect, and the contaminated crime scene all limited the potential for forensic breakthrough. The case's enduring fame meant that it continued to generate occasional investigative activity. When cold case units were established in later decades, the Black Dahlia case was periodically reviewed to assess whether new techniques or fresh perspectives might advance the investigation. These reviews confirmed what had been known since 1947: the physical evidence was insufficient, the witness testimony was too contaminated by press coverage and the passage of time, and the investigative foundation was too compromised to support successful prosecution even if a viable suspect could be identified. The bridge into Episode 5, which would explore the various suspects proposed over the decades, was built from this foundation of failed investigation and developing mythology. The suspects who would be examined, the theories that would be debated, the evidence that would be reinterpreted, all emerged from the gap between what was known and what remained unknowable. The investigation had ended, but the case would never truly close. It would remain open not just in official police records but in cultural consciousness, a permanent unsolved mystery that would generate theories, accusations, and speculation for as long as people were interested in crime, in Los Angeles history, and in the question of who had killed Elizabeth Short and why they had never been brought to justice. The transformation was complete. The Elizabeth Short murder, which had begun as a criminal investigation on a January morning in 1947, had become the Black Dahlia case, a cultural phenomenon that transcended its origins and entered the realm of permanent American mythology. The investigation had failed, but the story would never end. Epilogue: Lessons from Failure. The Elizabeth Short investigation represents more than an unsolved murder. It stands as a comprehensive case study in how criminal investigations can fail despite enormous resource investment and public attention. The lessons from this failure, many of which were not recognized or implemented until decades later, shaped modern investigative practices and forensic protocols in ways that continue to influence law enforcement today. The crime scene contamination that occurred in the first hour established a pattern that would be repeated in high-profile cases for years afterward. The failure to immediately secure the perimeter, the presence of civilians and press within the crime scene, and the destruction of potential evidence through foot traffic all demonstrated the critical importance of rapid, decisive action when a body is discovered. Modern crime scene protocols, with their emphasis on immediate perimeter establishment and restricted access, emerged partly from recognition of failures like those at South Norton and 39th. The relationship between media and investigation, which proved so destructive in the Black Dahlia case, would remain problematic for decades. The contamination of witness memory through press coverage, the leaking of sensitive details that should have been withheld, and the creation of public narratives that influenced investigative direction all demonstrated the dangers of unrestricted media access to investigative information. Modern media management protocols, including the designation of single spokespersons, the careful control of information release, and the understanding that certain details must be withheld from publication, reflect lessons learned from cases like this one. The tunnel vision that developed around the surgical killer theory demonstrated how institutional commitment to a specific investigative direction can prevent recognition of alternative possibilities. Once the theory was publicly announced and resources committed to pursuing it, changing direction became difficult despite the absence of supporting evidence. Modern investigative practices emphasize the importance of maintaining multiple working theories, regularly reassessing assumptions, and avoiding premature commitment to explanations that haven't been thoroughly tested. The fragmentation of investigative effort across multiple teams without effective coordination showed the necessity of unified command structure in complex cases. The creation of task forces with clear leadership, centralized information management, and regular coordination meetings emerged as best practice partly because of recognition that the alternative, autonomous teams working parallel tracks, led to duplication of effort, lost information, and investigative gaps. The Black Dahlia case provided a clear example of what not to do in terms of organizational structure. The evidence preservation failures, from the contaminated crime scene to the missing clothing and personal belongings, demonstrated the critical importance of systematic evidence collection and documentation. Modern evidence protocols, with their emphasis on photographing items in situ before collection, maintaining chain of custody documentation, and preserving materials for future analysis using techniques not yet developed, all reflect understanding that evidence collected today may become valuable in ways that aren't immediately apparent. The victimology work that devolved into moral judgment rather than remaining focused on investigative relevance showed how social biases can corrupt investigation. The emphasis on Elizabeth Short's sexuality and lifestyle, presented as relevant to understanding her murder when it actually served primarily to satisfy prurient interest and confirm prejudices, demonstrated how investigators' personal attitudes can shape what information is considered important. Modern training in avoiding victim blaming and maintaining focus on behaviors and associations that are genuinely relevant to the crime reflects recognition of this failure. The phenomenon of false confessions, which consumed enormous investigative resources while providing no value, led to development of better protocols for evaluating and handling confessors. Modern practice includes rapid screening for knowledge of withheld details, assessment of confessors' mental state and motivation, and procedures for quickly eliminating false confessions while documenting them adequately in case they later prove relevant. The Black Dahlia case, with its 60-plus false confessors, provided extensive experience in what doesn't work. The investigation's publicity, which initially seemed beneficial in generating tips and maintaining public engagement, ultimately proved counterproductive. The circus atmosphere that developed around the case, the tourist visits to the disposal site, and the discouragement of genuine witnesses who didn't want to be drawn into the media spectacle all demonstrated that excessive publicity could harm investigation as much as help it. Modern understanding of when to seek publicity and when to conduct investigation quietly reflects this lesson. The failure to identify and secure the primary crime scene, the location where Elizabeth Short was actually murdered and mutilated, represented a critical gap that could never be filled. The disposal site provided minimal information compared to what the actual murder location would have offered. Modern investigative emphasis on distinguishing between disposal sites and murder locations, and on making identification of the primary scene a high priority, reflects recognition of how much was lost in the Black Dahlia case by never finding where the crime actually occurred. The cold case phenomenon itself, the transformation of an active investigation into a dormant file that might or might not be periodically reviewed, demonstrated the need for better systems to manage long-term investigations. Modern cold case units, with their specialized focus and their systematic review of older unsolved cases, represent an institutional response to the recognition that cases like the Black Dahlia required continued attention even when active leads had been exhausted. The forensic limitations of 1947, particularly the absence of DNA technology, meant that evidence was collected and preserved without full understanding of how it might eventually be analyzed. Modern practice of collecting and preserving biological evidence even when current technology can't fully analyze it reflects understanding that future capabilities may allow breakthroughs in cases that seem hopeless with current methods. The Black Dahlia case, with its washed and drained body, represented a worst-case scenario, but other cases from the same era that preserved evidence better have been solved decades later through application of techniques that didn't exist when the crimes occurred. The amateur investigator phenomenon, which the Black Dahlia case helped establish, demonstrated both the public hunger for resolution and the problems that arise when amateur theories are treated as equivalent to professional investigation. The boundary between legitimate public interest and interference with investigation, between helpful theorizing and harmful accusation, remains difficult to maintain. But recognition of the phenomenon and its potential for both assistance and obstruction emerged partly from experience with cases like this. The question of when to formally close a case, versus leaving it officially open but practically dormant, raises issues that remain unresolved. The Black Dahlia case stayed open because its high profile made formal closure impossible, but the distinction between officially open and actually investigated became meaningless. Modern practice varies by jurisdiction, but the tension between official status and investigative reality remains. The Elizabeth Short murder, unsolved after 75 years, stands as a permanent reminder of the limits of investigation. Despite extensive effort, despite public attention, despite resources that exceeded what most murder investigations receive, the killer was never identified. The case became famous precisely because it failed, because it represented the nightmare scenario where every investigative advantage, public interest, media coverage, and departmental commitment couldn't produce resolution. The investigation's failure was not inevitable. Better crime scene management, more systematic evidence collection, less media contamination, more focused investigative direction, and arguably some measure of luck might have produced a different outcome. But the failure was also not surprising. Murders can be unsolvable. Killers can successfully evade identification. Evidence can be insufficient. The Black Dahlia case demonstrated these uncomfortable truths in ways that couldn't be ignored or minimized. The mythology that developed around the case, the endless theories and proposed suspects and amateur investigations, represents a form of cultural processing of the failure. If the official investigation couldn't provide answers, then alternative investigations would attempt to fill that gap. The credibility of these alternative theories varies enormously, from careful analysis based on genuine research to wild speculation unsupported by any credible evidence. But they all emerge from the same source: the human need for resolution, for answers, for the comfort of knowing that even the darkest crimes can eventually be understood and their perpetrators identified. The case continues to generate interest not despite being unsolved but precisely because it remains unsolved. A solved case, no matter how brutal or complex, eventually becomes historical fact. An unsolved case remains active in imagination, open to interpretation, available for each generation to examine using its own assumptions and techniques. The Black Dahlia case has been investigated through the lens of 1940s assumptions about female morality, 1960s counterculture fascination with Hollywood darkness, 1970s feminist analysis of violence against women, modern psychological profiling, and contemporary forensic techniques. Each era brings its own perspective while the basic facts remain unchanged. The investigation ended in spring 1947 when resources were redirected and momentum collapsed. But the case has never ended. It continues in cold case files, in amateur investigation, in cultural production, in academic analysis of investigative failure. Elizabeth Short's killer died long ago, almost certainly, and took the truth about her final days to the grave. But the investigation of her murder, in some form, will likely continue as long as people are interested in crime, in mysteries, in the question of how someone could commit such violence and successfully escape identification. The lessons from the investigation's failure have been learned, forgotten, and relearned multiple times over the subsequent decades. Each new generation of investigators encounters cases that repeat some of the same mistakes: contaminated crime scenes, tunnel vision, media interference, evidence preservation failures. The problems are endemic to complex investigations under pressure. But awareness of what went wrong in cases like the Black Dahlia provides reference points, examples of failure that can guide better practice. The Elizabeth Short murder remains unsolved. The investigation failed comprehensively. The killer was never identified. Justice was never achieved. These facts are uncomfortable but undeniable. The case stands as monument to investigative limits, to the reality that despite best efforts and extensive resources, some crimes remain forever mysterious. The investigation ended, but the myth it created, the lessons it taught, and the questions it raised continue to resonate through law enforcement, through popular culture, and through the broader understanding of how violence, investigation, and justice intersect in American society. Postscript: the evidence that remains. 75 years after Elizabeth Short's murder, certain physical evidence still exists in various archives and storage facilities. The autopsy photographs, sealed for decades before eventually being released under Freedom of Information laws, provide permanent documentation of the injuries inflicted. These images, disturbing and graphic, represent the most objective record of what was done to Elizabeth Short. They can be examined by modern forensic pathologists, compared with injuries in other cases, and analyzed using understanding of wound patterns and violence dynamics that didn't exist in 1947. The LAPD case file, massive and sprawling, contains thousands of pages of reports, interviews, and documentation from the original investigation. This file has been digitized and is accessible to researchers, though sensitive materials remain redacted. The file provides a comprehensive record not just of what was investigated but of how investigative decisions were made, what theories were pursued, and why certain directions were prioritized over others. It's a historical document as much as an investigative resource. Various items collected from the disposal site remain in evidence storage, though their condition and potential forensic value have degraded over decades. In theory, advances in forensic technique might allow new forms of analysis of materials that were collected but could not be adequately examined in 1947. In practice, the contamination of the scene and the limited preservation protocols of the era mean that most physical evidence has minimal value for modern investigation. The newspaper archives provide another form of evidence, a record of how the case was understood and reported in real time. These archives document the media's role in shaping public perception and investigative direction. They preserve details that might not appear in police reports. They capture the atmosphere of the time in ways that official documents cannot. Researchers examining the case decades later rely heavily on these newspaper archives to understand what was known when and how information flowed between investigation and public. Witness statements, taken in the first weeks and months after the murder, exist in the case file and provide accounts from people who knew Elizabeth Short or who had information about her movements. These statements are frozen in time, capturing what people remembered or claimed to remember in 1947 before subsequent media coverage and cultural mythology colored their recollections. The statements are of varying reliability, some obviously influenced by newspaper coverage even at the time, others providing details that seem genuine and uncontaminated. The autopsy report itself, Dr. Newbarr's comprehensive documentation of the body's condition and his findings about cause of death, remains the authoritative medical record of the crime. This report has been examined by numerous pathologists over the decades, each bringing contemporary understanding of forensic pathology to bear on the 1947 findings. The report's conclusions have generally been confirmed by later analysis, though interpretations of what the injuries reveal about the killer have evolved as psychological profiling and understanding of violent behavior have developed. Photographs of Elizabeth Short from her life provide context about who she was before her murder. These images, preserved in family collections and newspaper files, show a young woman who appeared in snapshots and formal portraits, ordinary in the ways that most people are ordinary. The photographs contradict the mythology in subtle ways, showing someone whose life was not dominated by the darkness that would characterize accounts of her death. The geography of the case, the physical locations where Elizabeth Short lived, worked, and socialized in the months before her death, can still be documented. Some buildings remain standing and can be visited. Others have been demolished or repurposed. But the spatial framework of her life and death can still be traced, providing physical context that helps researchers understand the practical aspects of her movements and the opportunities that existed for someone to intercept her. Letters and correspondence, some preserved in the case file and others held by family members, provide Elizabeth Short's own voice in ways that investigative reports and newspaper accounts do not. These documents are limited but valuable, offering glimpses of how she understood her own life and circumstances. They complicate the narrative that emerged from police victimology work, showing complexity and nuance that official characterizations often missed. The disposal site itself, now developed with housing but still identifiable, represents physical connection to the crime. Visitors to the location can stand where the body was found, can understand the spatial relationships between the vacant lot and surrounding houses, can assess the visibility and accessibility that made the site suitable for the killer's purposes. The physical reality of the location provides context that photographs and descriptions cannot fully capture. This evidence, fragmentary and limited as it is, represents what remains of the Elizabeth Short case in physical terms. It's not sufficient to solve the crime, not adequate to identify the killer, but it provides foundation for understanding what happened and what was done in response. The evidence documents not just a murder but an investigation, not just a crime but a cultural moment, not just a victim but an era. The case will remain unsolved. The evidence that might have identified the killer was never collected, was contaminated beyond use, or was never present to begin with. But the evidence that does exist ensures that the case can be studied, analyzed, and understood even if it cannot be resolved. Elizabeth Short's murder will continue to be examined, her killer will continue to be speculated about, and the investigation's failures will continue to provide lessons for as long as people care about crime, justice, and the mysteries that define American criminal history. The investigation ended. The evidence remains. The questions persist. And the Black Dahlia case, born from violence in January 1947, continues as permanent American mythology, forever unsolved, forever compelling, forever raising questions about justice, investigation, and the violence that sometimes escapes accounting.
Hey, a true crime. Hey, a true crime. Hey, a true crime. The intelligence is artificial, but the crimes are real.